Kim from stampingimperfection.com. I'm doing the Make the Cards challenge this week, and it is an ombre challenge. It's a purple ombre challenge. So I'm going to make 4 different ombre cards with several different techniques. So I've got 4 different twists here on ombre techniques. I'm starting off with my favorite technique, which is just a watercolor wash. So I'm using a set of inks from Altenew, and I can't remember the name of the set, but it includes Andromeda, Ultraviolet, Hydrangea, and Wisteria. And I think it's so pretty. And you can see I have a nice wide brush. I spritzed my paper with water, and this is watercolor paper. I spritzed it with water, and then I spread the water out over that whole piece of paper with that nice wide flat brush. So I squished my ink pad, and I used the ultraviolet ink pad onto my craft mat, spritzed it with water, and started spreading it on my card piece. So this is a wet on wet technique because my card panel is wet and my ink is wet. So I'm trying to keep it darker on the left hand side and lighter on the right hand side. So when I put the color down, generally I put the color on the left hand side and then use the water to pull out the color toward the right hand side, and it lightens up as you start like spreading the ink around. So I decided I wanted a little darker on the bottom, so I pulled out the darkest color, which is Andromeda, and I'm just kind of dabbing it on, and now I'm just going to pull that across without adding any more ink. I'll just keep pulling it across. So I have the darkest point on the left hand side, and I want the right hand side to be pretty light, so I'm not putting very much color on that. So I'll just continue this all the way across and just keep blending because I want a nice smooth blend. Now you can tape down your papers. I did not tape down my paper. I just wanted to do a quick wash. So I put that aside to dry, and I'm moving on to my second technique. My second technique is a resist technique. So I'm starting out with this really pretty rose petal stamp set from Scrappy Tales Crafts, and I'm using Bristol cardstock. Bristol cardstock is a beautiful cardstock whenever you want to do some ink blending. So I'm starting out by adding my image here, and I'm using the Bud Vase and the Have a Rosy Day sentiment from that Scrappy Tales Crafts rose petal stamp set, and I'm going to emboss this. I'm going to heat emboss this in white embossing powder. So I'm just lining everything up, being super fussy too, I might add. And I'm just going to pull out my Versamark ink and my white embossing powder. I also pull out I have a bunch of coffee filters that I use for embossing. They work perfectly, so I just keep those on my desk. So I'm going to stamp this a couple of times in that Versamark ink. This is still my favorite embossing ink. I've tried a few others. I just really love this Versamark. So it's just my go-to embossing ink and watermark ink. So I'm just going to cover that with my white embossing powder. And you'll notice that I did not use the powder tool. You can use that powder tool before you go ahead and stamp your image. I don't use the powder tool. Instead, I brush off any excess with a paintbrush like this at the end. I'm allergic to all forms of powder, so it doesn't matter what I use. I'm just allergic. So I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. And once I have it all heat set, I realize the edge of my paper is kind of raggedy. It's time for a new blade in my paper trimmer. So I'm using my Tombow sanded eraser just to sort of erase the edges, and that always cleans up the edges of those papers. So that's a nice little tool. For like less than $3, you can have an eraser that cleans up your mistakes, and it cleans up the edges of your paper when they get pretty raggedy. So now I'm just going to ink blend across that image. I love this because you can see the image emerge as you do this. So I'm using a set of 4 inks from Altenew that are designed to blend nicely together and to layer nicely. And I start out with the lightest color, which is called Wisteria, and I am covering the whole panel with the lightest color. So I'm just lightly coloring that with the lightest color, and that's as light as I want to make the top of that. So I'm just making sure it's nice and tidy. So then I'm going to move on to my next color, which is Hydrangea. Once I have all of that light purple blended in, I'll move on to the Hydrangea color. So I've got the whole thing sort of evenly covered with that light color. So I'll move on to the second color, which is Hydrangea, and I'm going to start at the bottom because that's where I want it to be the darkest. I'm going to add this color from the bottom up to where I want the Hydrangea color to end. So I won't go all the way to the top because I want to keep the top lightest. I'm also going to do this to two plain panels. So I'm going to create this same ink blended ombre effect on two plain panels of this Bristol paper so that I have four backgrounds all together. So once I get the wisteria as dark as I would like it to be, everywhere except the top, I'll move on to the next color. Now I do take out that wisteria again so that I can blend between the hydrangea color and the wisteria color. I want to keep that really smooth. So now the third color I'm using is called Ultraviolet. And I'm, again, starting at the end I want to keep dark and gently blending all the way down and adding a little bit more ink as I need it. And I'm taking that down to where I want it to meet that hydrangea, that second color that I added on. And always trying to keep the base the darkest. So again, I'm taking the hydrangea foam here and blending where I just ended. And now I'm taking my darkest color, the Andromeda, and I'm just going along the base, and I'm just going to add that to the base. This is such a pretty way to do an ombre technique. And you can make distinct lines if you want to. There's nothing that says they have to be blended perfectly. You can make them like lines. Like that's if you were using colored cardstock and using different shades of colored cardstock, you'd have distinct lines where one color started and another one ended. So when I'm done with that Andromeda color, I again smooth out all the spots where they meet. So I'm just trying to smooth where they do meet because I do want a nice even blend here. I'm just going to finish off with that wisteria color, and that's going to complete my ink blending for this color. So that completes the ink blending, and you can see how nicely it turns out. You want to clean up your craft mat right away. And I use my microfiber cloth just to like buff up the embossing that I did. Excuse me. And just get the ink off the embossing. That embossing resists the ink, so you get a really, really nice little blend. So I've got 4 different backgrounds created now. And I'm going to take the one ink blended panel that I left plain. I've cut all the panels down to 4 by 5 1/4, and I've decided that I'm going to use this Altenew Mega Greetings stamp set. They have 4 different Mega Greetings stamp set, and I'm going to use the word "you" here and heat set that in white embossing powder. So I'm just going to put this in my little mini MISTI and add that word, and I'm thinking that I want to use "You Are Loved," so I'm going to heat emboss the "you" in white embossing powder, and then I'm going to stamp and emboss the "Are Loved" on a piece of white cardstock with black embossing powder. So I'll just do this one in white. And again, before you stamp, if you like to use the powder tool, this is the point where you use it. You use the powder tool before you do the stamping. And then ink it up with your embossing ink, add your embossing powder, and heat set. So here's where I'm doing my secondary sentiment. This is the "Are Loved" part. I've inked it on a piece of white cardstock in Versamark. I'm adding some black embossing powder, and I'm going to use my brush because, again, I don't use a powder bag, and I heat set that, and now I'm just trimming it down. So I'm using my trimmer, and I'm really comfortable with my trimmer. I know exactly where it cuts, and that is one of the keys, I think, to make those little sentiments. So now I'm thinking that I want to add a special little touch to all of these card panels that I've created, because I want to put them on a purple mat and then put that on a white card base. So I have some nice contrast there. But the purple matte kind of gets blended in, so I'm going to add a little gold embossing detail. So you can see I'm just running the edge of my card in the Versamark and then running it in the gold embossing powder, and then I heat set it. And you can see it's a very subtle little detail, but it actually allows that purple matte that I'm putting in the back to stand out really nicely. So I do this to all of my card panels. And the first one I just did one side at a time. This time I do two sides, and again, I'm going to use my paintbrush to just wipe off any excess that, is stray powder. So now I'm moving on to creating the piece I want to use on my watercolor panel. And again, I'm using one of these mega greeting sets from Altenew. This is a big hello. You can see I've used this a lot. This is my favorite one. If you only get one, the hello is it. It works for everything. So I decided that I really wanted to use the big hello die, but I realized I don't have the big hello die. So I decide I'm going to use my brother's Scan and Cut. So I want this to also have an ombre effect. So I put the darkest color at the top, and I'm putting the lightest color at the bottom. And then since I'm using ink cubes, this makes this a little bit easier. It's not great for blending. If you do a lot of blending, ink cubes aren't the tool you want to use. You want a full-size ink pad. But for something like this, like I'm just dabbing on the ink and just sort of blending one color into the next. And I put the darker one on the top of the word hello, the lightest one on the bottom. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this through my brother's Scan and Cut so it cuts it out. I also cut out two just plain hellos, and I glued them to the backside of the colored one. And now I'm just inking this up with Versamark, and I'm going to go ahead and use some clear embossing powder. So I ink that up just by pushing it down, and if you don't get it perfect, don't worry about it because you're going to do this more than one time. So this is clear embossing powder, and usually I have a pair of tweezers, but they're buried on my desk somewhere. You can imagine what my desk looks like at this point. So I can't find my tweezers, so I'm just going to use my fingers and carefully pick it up, and I'm going to slide it onto, I have a couple like pizza style boards, and I'm going to heat set that. And then once that is heat set, it's going to look a little lumpy, and it's pretty. I could leave it just like that. And notice you can see the ombre effect here. So I'm inking this up a second time. I'm just going right over top of the first one, and then I'm just going to put this in the embossing powder and cover it again with the clear. Now the more layers of that die cut you have cut out and glued together, and the more times you do this, the more it looks like an enamel piece. Like I only did this twice and I only have 3 layers there, but once I heat set it, it's so shiny and it's very sturdy. So look how pretty that looks on that panel. Like that looks really pretty on that watercolor panel. Now I have another one that I ink blended just like I showed, and then I took my stencil from Sassy and Crafty called Smoke Rising and spritzed it with water and put it onto the ink blended panel. I let it sit for about 20 seconds, pulled it off, blotted up the excess water. So I have this really pretty background, but it needs a cup. So I'm going to use a teacup, and I'm going to use a sentiment that goes along with that teacup. So I just stamped that in the ultraviolet ink, and then I stamped it in clear ink and or Versamark ink, and added clear embossing powder, and I heat set it. So I have a nice embossed purple line. So it still looks purple, but it's now embossed because I used clear embossing powder. And it's all heat set. So now I'm just using my ultraviolet ink, and I'm just noticed that I again added water to the top of the teacup. So my teacup was wet, and now I'm just adding that wet ink, and I put a light coating of the watered down ink on, and now I'm just adding some extra dark touches to a couple of spots where I want it to appear a little darker, so that I'll have this nicely shaded watercolor like teacup. And what I love about this is that I don't have a lot of control over where those dark spots are, because I am doing the wet on wet technique, so that actually really makes it flow on its own, and I really like that. So I'm adding a little bit of brown, and I believe this is the tea dye, actually, to make it look like milky tea. And then I'm just going to let this dry, and I'll go ahead and fussy cut out that cup when I'm all done. So I've got some dark spots, I've got some light spots. I'm pretty happy with the way this is, and it dries pretty quickly, believe it or not. So I'm going to fuss with it and then fussy cut it out. So I have all my cards together now. All of the cards got a white base and a purple matte, and they all have that gold edge around the ombre panel. So this is the watercolor one with the die cut that I clear embossed. And then here's the ink blended one, the ink resist one. That was the easiest one. This is the one with the smoke rising stencil that I used the water on. I added the teacup and a sentiment. This is the plain ink blended one, and this is the watercolor panel. And the U and the hello are from the Mega Greetings stamp sets from Altenew. And the teacup is a vintage teacup. I'll put all the links for these things below. And you can see you can do a lot with just your inks to create ombre backgrounds and little twists on them, so they're all very different. So I'll add the links below. Please give this video a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed, I would love to have you subscribe to my channel and click the bell so you get notifications every time I upload a video. Thank you for watching.